This week's episode is sponsored by Babysitter Massacre, Camp Carnage, the third sleazy slasher book in the Babysitter Massacre series, written by David O'Hanlon and created by me. It's hunting season, and there's no bag limit on babysitters. After his only child dies due to an incompetent sitter, Patton Moore establishes Camp Care. His graduates are highly sought after, and candidates will do anything for a spot. But this time, they'll wish they hadn't. Someone's brought some extra baggage for the stay, and it's up to Macy and the other unhappy campers to figure out who's behind the string of gruesome killings, while being stalked through an unforgiving wilderness full of deadly traps. As the body count climbs, old wounds are torn open, and not everyone is who they seem. Who will survive Camp Carnage? Find it today on Kindle and paperback at Amazon.com.
What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my friends. It's Wednesday, and you know what that means. It's time for a dose of your spooky on the Weekly. I'm, of course, your host and narrator, Henrik Kuto, and we have something hot for you this week. Really, really hot, because, you know, when most of North America is going through a heat wave, my first thought is, how do we tap into that? How do we get a story out that's about one real hot night? And our good friend John Oak Dalton has delivered in spades. But before we get to that, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for subscribing. Whether it's on Apple Podcasts or TuneIn or Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts, if you're not subscribed, please just click that little button. Help us out. Listen to us every single Wednesday for a brand new horror tale, and be aware, the big 2-part 100th episode special is right around the corner, and I can't wait to share it with you. Oh, it's a fright and it's a hoot. And if you want to keep hearing us tell you a story every single week, head over to WeeklySpooky.com and shoot us a tip, a donation, or join our Patreon and get all kinds of awesome stuff. But anyway, this week's story is about one very hot night at a summer camp. The heat tends to bring out something primal in us, something angry. You know, often anger is related to fire. Well, tonight, anger, repressed rage, and fire are all coming together. So, my friends, get comfortable and let's listen to the story. Camp Dead and Buried by John Oak Dalton. It was so hot. It was like the dead-ass middle of summer, but it was the last night of the year at rickety old Camp Elderberry, which everyone called Camp Dead and Buried, because it was a boring place to spend your summer. The summer camp historically closed the Friday before Labor Day weekend, and then the counselors were always allowed to stay on for one long, extended party, smoking any stash they had forgotten about and sleeping with anybody they had had their eye on all summer and hadn't made it with yet. But that was the 60s and 70s, and this was the year of our Lord, 1980 AD, and everybody needed to knuckle down and get some shit done. So in Wampanoag Cabin, commonly called Wang Dang Sweet Poontang Cabin, the senior female counselors were gathered to study for the babysitting test that was always administered by Mrs. Blonner on the first day of school that following Tuesday. Mrs. Blonner was the home ec teacher at Virgil Gus Grissom Consolidated High School, home of the Rockets, and had been administering her own handwritten test on the first day of the year since Jesus took a carpentry class. Parents came to the school to get a mimeographed list of the girls who had passed the test. And that was the make or break list for the plum babysitting jobs for the school year. Gunilla Cassidy led the study group, and included all the senior counselors and some of the hotter junior ones that might be in the crosshairs of the senior male counselors this last weekend. She was called Guns by everybody, a nickname she chose to embrace because she was a badass, and also because she was named after Gunilla Hutton from Petticoat Junction, and she would rather people forget that. Thankfully, everybody said she looked like a teenage Linda Ronstadt. It wasn't until 1978 that Mrs. Blonner found out that her test had been circulating freely through the school for a couple of decades, so she wrote a new one each year, and hard as she tried, Guns could not get a copy, and that pretty much sucked for everybody. On the other side of the quadrangle that made up the counselors' cabins was Wapahani Cabin, commonly called Wipe Your Hiney Cabin, where the junior male counselors and 2 visitors from the junior female counselors' cabin, La Jola, obviously called La Jailbait, were finishing up an epic summer-long Outcast Swords quest, with a picnic table strewn with hex paper, pencils, dice, and little lead figurines. They paced themselves to finish up tonight before leaving Sunday. Friday, the guys had wanted to watch The Incredible Shrinking Man on Channel 13, and the girls wanted to watch El Cid on Channel 8, but the girls were outvoted, 4-1, though halfway through that movie got boring and they all switched to El Cid. Later, they saw The Avengers, and then Bob Hope on Johnny Carson, and by that time, it was too late to start. Sebastian was the leader of the junior counselors in every aspect, including being in charge of running Outcast Swords all summer. His older brother Marcus, called Keys, was the de facto leader of the senior counselors, and that helped. But the 2 brothers couldn't have been more different. Sebastian was a short, lumpy, tan kid with black, frizzy hair. He was called Black and Mexican and Hawaiian and Arab and Samoan and a few other random things. Marcus also was tan, but he was tall and muscular and had long curly blonde hair and a wedge of beard cut square like King Tut. He belonged wherever he wanted to land and nobody ever asked him what he was. But their father was biracial and their mother was white, and in rural Indiana, it was tricky. "What it is, little brother?" Keys crowded the door of Wipe Your Hiney with the senior counselors. "Hey man." Sebastian gave his brother a half wave. "You guys gonna come party with us or hang out here?" Keys asked. "Hang out here," Sebastian said. "Okay, just thought I'd check. I'm going to get supplies out of the Barracuda," Keys answered. Is it any surprise Keys had a 1970 Plymouth Barracuda? Sebastian had a 1968 AMC Rambler his mom used to drive. While Sebastian's friends looked either annoyed or terrified by the appearance of Keys and the older guys, Sebastian knew that his brother had bestowed his blessing on their night of role-playing. Thus, the senior counselors would not come back in the dead of night for wedgies, swirlies, or any other rites of passage as Sebastian's friends became the senior counselors the following year. If the dilapidated old camp was still open in 1981. Either way, Keys was the lone holdout for going out in style. There was one other person thinking about going out in style, and that was the only adult left, the handyman, Mr. Little. Little lived in basically a shed in the woods, and nobody saw him unless the shitter backed up, and that was fine with everybody. He was the kind of creep that could only get a job as a handyman at a broke-down summer camp. That night, Little was thinking about the Doom Pussy. Those night flights on B-57s from Bin Hao Air Base into Laos and North Vietnam. Those pilots wore a patch that said, "Into the mouth of the cat of doom." And unless you flew a Canberra into that hellhole, You couldn't have that patch. Little was also thinking it was hotter than any night in the Nam, and the woods seemed awfully dark and close. The hooting of an owl and the sounds of crickets began to be replaced in Little's mind with the chattering of monkeys and the slithering of snakes and other jungle sounds. An M60 firing at 100 rounds a minute could really clear the woods of Victor Charlie, but all Little had was a Colt 1911 pistol a South Vietnamese officer had once owned, and it would have to do. He had a Montagnard crossbow mounted on the wall that looked like a toy, but was used by the fiercest warriors Vietnam had ever seen. Thankfully, they hated the VC more than anybody else, and made the Ho Chi Minh Trail a death trap. It might be a good night to honor their memory. In the trunk of the Barracuda, Keyes had a bong he had told his mom was a sculpture, and a couple of cases of Falstaff he drove over to Ohio and bought. Big Red had a bottle of Old Fitzgerald they hadn't managed to finish. Orrin had a bottle of Galliano he had smuggled from home because his dad made Harvey Wallbangers, and that was some fucking embarrassing shit, but they would probably drink it anyway. Pete always had the good weed. He was called Havana because he rolled his joints as fat as bratwursts. Keyes went back to the senior male cabin, which was really called Firehawk Cabin, and that was pretty fucking cool, so they stayed with that. They had all this sweet stuff in tow and decreed that they were putting on records. It was Keyes' record player, so he got to choose. They had started calling him Keyes when they had gone to the drive-in earlier that summer and saw Three the Hard Way. Jim Kelly was called Mr. Keyes in that, and it wasn't so much that Marcus looked like Jim Kelly, but instead it was more the attitude. If you were a biracial kid in Indiana in 1980 and you wanted to rock out but also keep it righteous, your choices were limited. You had Hendrix, Richie Havens, Thin Lizzy of course, but number one for Keyes was Arthur Lee and Forever Changes. That was the first disc they were spinning that night. Havana still wanted to argue whether Klaatu was really the Beatles again, but every single dude there was sweating down his balls, so who gave a shit? The night before, which was the last night the kids were all there, Keyes had brought the record player down to the mess hall, and they had a disco for the young campers. Everybody was acting all cool until Keyes put on the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, and he and Guns went out on the makeshift floor and did the hustle, the bus stop, and the electric slide. And since they were the couple of the summer, once they did it, it was okay if everyone else got out and danced too. Keyes was still thinking about dancing with Guns when he lied to the others and said he had to go take a piss. He was going to walk straight to the Wang Dang Sweet Poontang cabin and see if he could scheme on getting Guns to go down to the lake with him, the only cool spot left in the whole fucking camp. He got close enough to see Guns through the open window, and she looked up and saw him outside, and he knew they were on the same wavelength. She said something to the other foxes in the room which he couldn't hear with the loud box fans running that somebody must have dragged back in from the Korean War or something. Then she met him outside the door, and he took her hand, and they headed for the lake. "I told them I went to get Virginia Slims," she said to Keyes. "Outside? We've been hiding them behind the rain barrel since it hasn't rained for a couple of weeks." Keyes nodded his approval, and they followed the path into the darkness. In Wipe Your Hiney cabin, Sebastian was getting his own vibe off of Melissa, another counselor who had gamed with them all summer, but on the last night with the adults gone returned to her truest form, rinsing her hair with purple Kool-Aid and wearing a Rocket to Russia t-shirt she copped off her older sister. Last night at the disco, she was looking straight at him when his brother played Kiss You All Over by Exile, and here she was looking at him again over a hand-drawn map on hex paper. Sebastian knew the tactics of how to slay a band of orcs, but not how to scheme on a purple-haired angel, and would have to channel his inner Keyes to figure it out, if he had any of his brother in him at all. Meanwhile, Keyes and Guns were getting it on in the lake. It wasn't their first time, but they both thought it might be their last. They went to schools in different towns anyway, but tonight they were the couple of the summer, and it was going to go all night. Guns thought Keys was biting her on the neck a little, which she wasn't that into, and then it hurt a lot, and she was very surprised to look down and see a pointed arrowhead sticking a little bit into her shoulder, but all the way through Keys' chest. Keys' eyes were wide open, and he opened his mouth to say something to Guns, and blood poured out. Guns screamed and pushed him away without thinking. Keys rolled and floated on his stomach, and Guns could see the arrow pointing right at the moon. There was a gust of air, and another arrow passed through the wings of her hair and nipped at the top of her ear. Guns screamed again and ducked her head under the water, her blood mixing with Keys across the surface of the lake. She held her breath as long as she could, and then a little longer. Little was cursing himself for not getting 2 clean kills, and he was pretty sure the screaming was going to draw out every Charlie within a few clicks, so he decided he needed to hump it to the villa and conduct a Zippo raid. It was time to burn this place to the ground. Sebastian had set the last night's adventure in an ice cave to sort of help with the heat, but it wasn't really working, and everyone was sweating through their clothes, down the back of their ears and in the crook of their knees, and had their mouths open trying to draw breath. When the first shouts came from outside, nobody had the strength to stir for a moment. But even though Sebastian was the de facto leader of the cabin, it was Jeff, who had a one-eyed fighter character called Snake after Snake Plissken, who was first out the door and thus got an arrow from the Montagnard crossbow in the chest. Sebastian stepped back and peered around the corner, one arm waving the other's back. He saw his brother's cabin on fire, and he wondered about that bong for a minute. Then he saw Orin running away with flames licking his shirt and Big Red lying still on the ground with an arrow in his neck. Somehow the record player was still spinning and was blasting out "Time Has Come Today" by the Chambers Brothers, and that, in itself, was pretty fucked up. Sebastian felt a stab of fear when he didn't see his brother, but went into Dungeon Master mode. He turned to the others. "Out the back window," he commanded. The others complied quickly, while Sebastian watched, but Melissa turned and grabbed his arm, and a different shock ran through Sebastian to his heart. "Come on!" she yelled. The others dawdled for a moment at her cry, but then a flaming arrow hit the doorframe and they all took off again. Sebastian looked into her eyes and shook his head. "I'm going to draw them off. You book it for Gun's cabin, she'll help you." Before she said anything else, and before Sebastian could think too hard, he ran through the open cabin door and started zigzagging, just like he did when his own character Wiglaf the Thief was under siege by those elven archers in Rivendell. Okay, he stole that 11 archers part from Lord of the Rings, but he was the only one who had finished the whole trilogy and everybody else couldn't get through Dune. Sebastian could hear arrows whistling around him, and that was fucking scary. But he saw the gravel road that led out to Highway 3 straight ahead. Suddenly, Sebastian tripped and fell into a small hole. Something hurt real bad, and Sebastian looked down and saw a sharpened spike sticking out of the top of his foot. It smelled strongly of piss, and Sebastian remembered reading that back in Vietnam, the Viet Cong would set punji stick traps and pee on them to make sure the American soldiers got infections. No elven archer had ever pissed on a punji stick, so suddenly Sebastian was out of his element and realized he had fucked up. Meanwhile, Guns, swimming one-handed, had pulled Keys to the rocky outcrop in the middle of the lake the kids called Thunder Island after the song. Guns liked the part of the song when he sang about the girl being the color of the Indian summer. Guns realized her mind was drifting and her scalp was bleeding, so she shook her head to clear it, causing a lance of pain and a shower of blood. She looked to the far-off shore and saw the glow of a fire. Keys didn't look good, but Guns thought it looked worse over there. So with one last look at Keys, she dived back in and started stroking for shore. Sebastian saw somebody walking towards him in the gloom, backlit by fire, carrying a motherfucking bow and arrow. Sebastian pulled at his leg as hard as he could, and his foot came off the punji stick trap, and he puked all the peach fago and corn chips he had consumed that night, and in some ways, that felt worse than anything. Sebastian tried to run, but kind of hobbled more so, though thankfully he was in the tree line in a few seconds and the bang, bang, bang of a pistol was close by, but also seemed thankfully far away. There was a payphone on Highway 3 just a short distance past the gate that everybody used to call parents back home, and that was all that was in Sebastian's mind at that moment. Guns was running as hard as she could with her lungs on fire and her arms and legs all rubbery, and almost didn't recognize Melissa with her purple hair when she ran into a handful of the junior counselors crouching in the trees. Guns saw what they were seeing, which was a bunch of flaming arrows hitting the side of the senior girl's cabin while her friends screamed inside. The juniors had screens only, but the senior counselors had glass windows and box fans. But tonight, that was the worst possible thing. So Guns grabbed a big chunk of wood off the ground and ran across the open stretch between the trees and the cabin and threw that log right through the window. She reached through and grabbed for Tammy, who was standing right there, frozen with her big cow eyes, and Guns knew she was never going to be able to pass the babysitter test no matter how much she studied. Melissa shouted, "Guns!" from right behind her, which surprised her that the younger counselor had followed her up there. She turned and saw Mr. Little coming around the corner of the cabin, drawn by the sound of smashing glass. He had a bow and arrow over his shoulder and a gun in his hand. The first shot went wide and knocked Tammy back from the window. The second lifted Melissa off her feet and into the darkness. Then Guns saw the black eye of the pistol, looking right at her. Sebastian climbed over the gate when he couldn't work the latch and fell on the dirt on the other side. Now he really was crawling, trailing blood, the light from the glass box with the frosted Indiana Bell logo on the side dead ahead. Sebastian heard, before he saw, the giant front end of a Chrysler Newport grumbling down the highway. The big car slowed and stopped, and Sebastian felt a flood of relief wash over his jangling nerves. An old woman peered out of the passenger window. "It's a colored boy. Keep driving, Jasper." And the Newport kicked up dirt and was gone. Of all the nights, thought Sebastian, and kept crawling. It wasn't much farther. He worked the glass door of the booth and fumbled the receiver while half steadying himself by the cord. He had heard you didn't need a dime if you were calling the cops, but he'd never tested it. It turned out to be true. "Operator, I'm at Camp Elderberry." "That old place is still open?" "Yes, ma'am. It's on fire, and somebody is shooting the place up." "Is this a practical joke, son?" "No, ma'am, it's real. We need cops and firemen and a couple of ambulances." "Calling the police is not a joke." "My brother, I don't know." Sebastian was really woozy now. "Have you been drinking, son?" "Just peach fago." Sebastian dropped the phone and slumped to the floor of the booth. Guns heard a click in the darkness. Mr. Little very calmly reached into his pocket and started rummaging around, and Guns knew he was just casually reloading like she wasn't standing there. So she got pissed and picked a ragged shard of glass off of the ground and ran for him, swinging. When she saw the arc of bright crimson against the moonlight, she knew Mr. Little recognized she was there after all. The glass cut her palm, but cut Mr. Little worse, and he sat down hard on the ground with blood coursing out of his throat, and Guns actually sat down next to him, because she was pretty tired herself. Neither Sebastian nor Guns heard the sirens coming from way far off. A couple of hours later, and Guns was watching the camp burn. The VFD were sort of controlling it rather than stopping it, but had heard the camp was probably going to close next year anyway, and at least now the owners could get some insurance off of it. Guns and Sebastian were alive, and Melissa was pretty much alive, and Keys was a little bit alive, but Many others were completely dead, including, thankfully, Mr. Little. Guns was sitting on the hood of an AMC Matador Enforcer that belonged to the county sheriff, trying to take it all in. The sheriff offered her a lucky strike, which was her grandpa's brand, but she was out of options. "Did you ever go into his old shed?" the sheriff asked. "God, no, nobody did." "So, you didn't know he was Biff Carter?" "No, sir. His name was Mr. Little. That was his real name. He wrote paperbacks under the name Biff Carter, those books about the castigator. His shelves were full of them." Guns vaguely remembered her dad had some of those around too. "Isn't the character a Vietnam veteran like Mr. Little?" "Yeah. Then he comes back and fights the mafia for a couple of books, then goes after whoever else is around after that. Black Panthers, hippies, whatever. But Little was never a Vietnam veteran." "He always said..." Guns trailed off. The sheriff blew smoke and pointed at his temple. "There was a sheet in the typewriter. The publisher wanted a new Biff Carter. He was getting fired off of his own creation. Guess it was, too much for him, especially on a hot night like this." Guns nodded, but wasn't listening anymore. She was thinking she was glad Keyes was alive, but it was one thing to have a mixed boyfriend over the summer, and another to have one during the school year. But she had saved his life, probably, and that meant something. Maybe she would bring him to homecoming anyway. But they wouldn't go to the bonfire. She was going to be sick of hot nights and fires and such for a very long time. All right, my friends, were you feeling the heat? Not only the heat of this oppressive summer season, but the heat of the burning cabins, of the rage, the anger, and the, I guess, the effect that one gets from a little too much creative spirit. Thank you so much, John Oak Dalton. He wrote that story right away. I came up with it last week, and I was like, hey, can you have this done in time for the show? And he came through. Thank you. I just felt like we needed a heat wave story to get us through this heat wave, because, you know, what's better when it's hot outside than listening to something chilling? So speaking of chilling, I want to say a big shout out to some people who are mighty cool. Now that is a radio quality transition, by the way, but I want to say a huge thank you not only to our Patreon backers, but to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who put in a little extra cash to help us keep going every single week. And this is 91 weeks in a row this week. And I get a little excited about that because you set a goal and you go for it. So huge thank you to Gino Lyons, Michael aka Sharm, Karen Weemet, Jeff and George Hilton, Craig Cohen, Rob Fields, and Kevin Fry. Thank you all for helping me bring the spooky on the weekly. I really love doing it. And you know, when I started doing this, I set a goal. 100 episodes in a row, no breaks. And I haven't let anything stop me. I haven't let a global pandemic stop me. I haven't let catching the coronavirus stop me. And I have no desire to stop now. So thank you for listening, my friends. If you want to get involved and help us keep the show going, go to weeklyspooky.com where you can donate, you can join the Patreon, you can buy some merchandise, or you can just send us an email, maybe even submit a story. I would love to hear from you. But now I got to get out of here. So for myself, for my producer, Dan Wilder, and for my composer, Ray Mattis, I will talk at you later.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.